Hey everyone, welcome to Professor Long's Lectures in Anatomy and Physiology. These videos are being done to the coronavirus shutdown. They're going to be quick and crude, no editing, all one take, so please bear with me. I'm doing the best I can, but as those of you who are in my class know, I walk in, ask where we left off, and start lecturing. I don't really follow, I follow my note set, but I have it in my head now, so I'm trying to think about where we're going and what we're doing and what's important, so these videos are kind of made up as we're going along. Please bear with me. Now, in the last video, this is for my 2401 students for Part 1A and P. This is for Lecture Test 6, or what would be the equivalent of Lecture Test 6. We were talking in the last video about the ventricles and the meninges and cerebral spinal fluid. One of the things I wanted to point out before I move on to the spinal cord is very often during development, not very often, but occasionally during development, there's some debris and some things that can block these interventricular foramina. And as we continue to secrete the cerebral spinal fluid, there's nowhere for it to drain. And the lateral ventricles, since the brain tissue is very, very early in development, that it's very squishy, the ventricles get larger and larger and larger. And you'll see these babies born with big, swollen, odd-looking shaped skulls and heads, and they call that hydrocephalus, water on the brain. It's not water, it's cerebral spinal fluid, usually due to a blocked interventricular foramen. Occasionally the cerebral aqueduct can also get blocked, but it's usually less often. So you have to go in and put shunts and other things to drain the fluid off and things. Anyway, I wanted to point that out. There's a lot of stuff going on that you'll be dealing with. When someone does a spinal tap, in order to sample cerebral spinal fluid, I was talking about how it flows in the subarachnoid space. Well, then what they'll do is they'll take a long needle. They'll usually have a patient flex their spine, and it's the same thing as doing an epidural block. In an epidural block, they'll put some fluid, some anesthetics outside between the two layers of dura mater. I didn't show you both layers of dura mater, but they're on the model. And in this epidural space, they'll stick a drug that will numb the roots of the nerves, the spinal nerves. We're about to do that anatomy, so I'll talk more about that. But if you're going to do a cerebral spinal fluid, if you're going to pull some cerebral spinal fluid off, it's called a spinal tap. They tap into the spinal fluid. They actually have to, an anesthesiologist will run a needle between your vertebrae and feel the dura mater and poke through it, and then stop in the subarachnoid space and then pull some of the fluid off. And then they can check the cerebral spinal fluid for bacteria, viruses, other things. So it's a pretty serious procedure, and it requires a lot of touch and feel. And so anesthesiologists are usually very, very skilled. They're very highly paid because they deserve to be. Anyway, so now we're going to start on the spinal cord itself. This is chapter 13. If you're following in my note sets on page 81, I'm going to go through all of these structures here and give you some definitions. I'm probably going to give you more of a verbal definition than writing everything out, or I may draw it so that you can see it, okay? When we look at the spinal cord, there's a certain anatomy to the spinal cord. The spinal cord starts developing as a large mass, but in order to fit in the smaller space, it folds in on itself, and it has a fold on the anterior and the posterior margins. So if we were to do a cross section of the spinal cord on the posterior margin, there's a very tight groove here called the posterior median sulcus. I'm just going to put PMS there. And then it folds out like this, and then there's some branches that come off and swell up a little bit and do this. This is sort of the anatomy of your spinal cord. And I'm going to draw a specific part of our spinal cord so that we can go over some of this, all right? And then we'll name all these structures in just a little bit. On the anterior margin, the gap is a little bit wider. It's a little bit more open, okay? And then we would have all the same features on the opposite side, okay? These little branches over here, we'll talk about in a little bit. If not in this video, eventually, okay? I didn't draw that very well on this side, but oh well, you'll bear with me here. You'll see what I'm getting at. And if you're in my class, in the note set, I already have drawings of this. I know that it's hard to learn to draw. When I was a student taking neurobiology, we had to do an essay test of this. We had a certain amount of time to draw it, label it, and talk about all the functions. I believe essay tests are the best way to learn, but woo, it's a lot of grading. We have a little hole in the middle called the central canal, and then we have the gray matter. Now in the brain, the gray matter is on the outside, the white matter is in the center. The spinal cord is the exact opposite. The gray matter is in the middle and will flare out into these structures that are referred to as horns. The gray matter will cross over to the opposite side of the spinal cord and form these structures. Kind of looks like a funky looking butterfly inside of there. All right. Now, this groove on the anterior margin is always a little bit wider gap, and they call that the anterior median fissure. Okay, fissure is a wide gap. A sulcus is a very tight groove. So anytime you look at a spinal cord, you should be able to tell anterior from posterior. Of course, the central canal is a hole in the center of the spinal cord. So I'm going to go down the list, and I'm going to point these features out, and I'm going to tell you what you should be writing in your notes. And you can look this up. The posterior median sulcus is simply a fold on the posterior margin of the spinal cord. The anterior median fissure is a little bit wider gap or fold on the anterior margin of the spinal cord. The central canal is a hole in the center of the spinal cord through which cerebral spinal fluid can flow up and down the spinal cord. These three areas out here would be your three gray horns, anterior gray horn, lateral gray horn, posterior gray horn. And then these would be your three white columns over here. These structures, and I'll talk about the structures and the functions in just a minute. We have some branches here that are called the roots. These are the roots of a spinal nerve, where all of these branches meet right about here. It's called a spinal nerve. I didn't draw mine quite long enough, but you get the idea. A spinal nerve is going to be one of the nerves that exits the spinal cord through the intervertebral foramen of your vertebrae. So these roots, we don't use the term anterior and posterior much for the roots. We use ventral and dorsal root. The dorsal root has a swelling called the dorsal root ganglion. We have a spinal nerve, and then we have several branches. This is called the ventral ramus. This is called the dorsal ramus. And this would be called the rami communicantes. It's two different rami that communicate with each other. And then we have an autonomic ganglion. I'm drawing this one for a reason, and an autonomic nerve. All of this anatomy we've kind of covered in lab, but this is our autonomic ganglion, autonomic nerve. Now, before I get into all of this, one of the things I want to show you, and I should have probably done this first, but hanging off the brain as the spinal cord comes down, it starts to narrow, but it has two enlargements. This isn't drawn to scale, but you get the idea. Okay, so if I were looking at a human being, this area would be near the cervical region. We call this the cervical enlargement. This is called the lumbar enlargement because it's in the lumbar part of your spine where the lumbar vertebrae is, or are. If I take a little piece of this off, the little bottom part looks like a little cone. So they call that the conus medullaris. And coming off of this region, there's a whole bunch of nerves that come off. And your spinal cord actually stops short of the sacrum a little bit. And your sacrum would be that fused group of vertebrae that have holes in it. And these little pieces come off and come out of those holes like this. And as they come off the conus medullaris, they extend down longer than the spinal cord does and exit through the sacrum. Because it looks like a horse's tail, that's called the cauda, which means tail, echina. Okay, equine is horse, so cauda echina is the horse's tail at the end. So let me give you some terminology here. If we're following the table on page 81, we did the posterior median sulcus, the anterior median fissure. We did the central canal, which is in the second part of the table, or in the second table. The cervical and lumbar enlargements are there because of this. I want you to think about it in these terms. I have afferent neurons coming into the spinal cord and efferent neurons coming out through my spinal nerves. And they're going to feed all the muscles and all the organs and everything of the chest and the abdominal and pelvic regions, okay? But in humans, because we have arms and legs, we have a lot more nerves going to and coming into and out of the extremities, the arms and the legs. Well, wherever I have extra traffic coming in on a freeway, we have extra lanes. We have merging lanes on and exiting lanes off. And so we have these enlargements to accommodate those nerves coming into and out of the spinal cord that serve either the upper extremities, that would be the cervical enlargement. It's an enlarged area of the spinal cord that accommodates additional innervation to the arms and legs. And the lumbar enlargement, to the arms, I should say. The lumbar enlargement accommodates the extra nerves going to the legs. So, we've knocked out most of this top part. The conus medullaris is just a tapered cone at the end of the spinal cord. The cauda equina is the thing that looks like a horse's tail. It's the nerves that exit through the sacrum. And we have a thing called the filum terminale, which is a little piece of connective tissue at the bottom of the spinal cord, at the tip of the conus medullaris, that kind of ties it to the end of the sacral canal. Because if we didn't hold it out to length, it would start to try to retract and come up, and it would stretch those nerves and damage them. So the spinal cord has to be held to length by the filum terminale, okay, which means the end hair. It's a piece of connective tissue that holds the spinal cord to length. All right, so we knocked some of that stuff out. I'm less concerned about all of these structures than I am about the second table, where we're going to talk about the functions of these other structures. So you can read about the spinal meninges. I covered those in the last video, so we're going to skip that part. When you get to the second table, I told you the central canal is a hole in the center of the spinal cord through which cerebral spinal fluid flows. It's connected to the fourth ventricle. Now, the posterior gray horn. Here's kind of what happens, okay? Our spinal nerves are a two-way street. If you recall when we did the cranial nerves, some cranial nerves are purely motor, some are purely sensory, and some are a little of both. All 31 pairs of spinal nerves are mixed nerves, meaning they have both sensory and motor information coming into and out. Now, if I had a sensory neuron coming in, that sensory neuron, no matter where it's going to come from, is going to enter through the spinal nerve. It's going to come through the dorsal root, and they're going to synapse somewhere in the posterior gray horn. The soma of this neuron is going to live in the dorsal root ganglion. If you recall in one of the previous lectures, a collection of neuron cell bodies in the CNS is usually called a nucleus or a center. In the peripheral nervous system, it's called a ganglion. So one of the functions of the dorsal root is exactly this. The dorsal root contains all incoming sensory neurons or afferent neurons that are entering the spinal cord. From every level of the spinal cord, we have the dorsal root containing the sensory neurons. The dorsal root ganglion is going to contain the somata of all sensory neurons entering the spinal cord. Okay? Doesn't matter which level we're at. And by the way, I guess I should have done this earlier too. Your spinal cord, as it tapers down, is cut into segments, like little coins stacked on top of each other. And every one of these would have a dorsal root with the dorsal root ganglion, a ventral root, and then a spinal nerve, and then that's going to branch, forming all these other structures that we've talked about, okay? These two little branches would be these two. All of these would be these over here. There's a spinal nerve, okay? And we would have this on both sides of the spinal cord, dorsal root with the dorsal root ganglion, the ventral root, the spinal nerve, dorsal ramus, ventral ramus, rami communicantes, and then an autonomic ganglion. At least some parts of the nervous, the thoracolumbar region, we have in some areas these autonomic ganglia. So, the next level of spinal cord would have the exact same anatomy. I'm not going to draw all the branches. So every level of the spinal cord has the same structures. They'll even have the same gray matter and white matter. Now, depending on what's going on, the gray matter may be much larger and thicker with less white matter, or in some parts of the spinal cord, there's less gray matter and more white matter. But nonetheless, every level of the spinal cord is set up identically. It has a pair of spinal nerves that are carrying sensory and motor information, and each segment has its own pair of spinal nerves. There's 31 pairs of spinal nerves. There's 31 segments of the spinal cord, okay? So this may look a little bit different, but every level, from the cervical to the thoracic to the lumbar to the sacral, all of the sections of the spinal cord have a pair of spinal nerves, have a dorsal root and a ventral root, a dorsal root ganglion, and a spinal nerve. A little of this might change somewhat depending on where we're at, but not a lot, okay? Now, if we took one of these sections out and I flipped it this way, that's what we would be looking at, okay? Now that we got some orientation, I hope that makes sense to you. It's kind of hard to explain visually what you're seeing, or explain verbally what you're seeing visually. So, when it comes to these structures, one of the things we know is that the dorsal root always contains the incoming sensory axons, and the dorsal root ganglion has the somata of the sensory neurons entering the spinal cord. The reason I did that first is because when I look in the posterior gray horn, there are two major areas here that are nuclei. They're called sensory nuclei because this is where the sensory neurons are going to synapse, release neurotransmitter, and then the neurons that receive that information at whatever level of the spinal cord is monitoring that part of your body, they're going to send that information up through the spinal cord towards your brain. So there's going to be a whole bunch of sensory neurons that live here that are just going to be receiving with their dendrites and everything, but the somata are here and they're going to be receiving sensory input. And they're going to send axons out and then up towards the brain through the white matter. These are going to be myelinated axons, so usually. Now, because this nucleus here is receiving sensory information, it turns out that the one that is further out at the tips of the posterior gray horn is called the somatic sensory nucleus. I didn't write that very well now, did I? This is called the somatic sensory nucleus. Okay, I put SSN up here, and I'm going to explain this. It stands for the somatic sensory nucleus. Now, I want to get something across to you guys. When we talk about somatic sensory, what we're talking about is sensations from the surface of the body and from some skeletal muscle, for the most part. So, if someone sticks you with a needle at a certain level of the spinal cord, that information would come in through a sensory neuron, through the dorsal root. Soma lives in the dorsal root ganglion, and it would synapse in the somatic sensory nucleus. If you tore a muscle, it'd be the same kind of thing. If you had some kind of visceral sensation, you do have viscera in the body, in the skin of the body, like sweat glands and sebaceous glands. So let's say you have an infected sebaceous gland, a zit or a boil. That's going to send a visceral sensation in here. And at some levels of the spinal cord, we're going to be receiving visceral information from the abdominal, pelvic, and the thoracic viscera. If that visceral information is visceral sensory, it's still going to come through the dorsal root. The soma will still live in the dorsal root ganglion, but that neuron is going to synapse and neurons living a little bit deeper in the posterior gray horn. And then they will send their axons maybe up a different bundle of axons here than this bundle of axons here. Okay? So, this structure is called the visceral sensory nucleus. I'm not going to write sensory nucleus out, but you get the idea. Viscera meaning soft organs, your guts. So I have a somatic and a visceral sensory nucleus. So ultimately, the function of the posterior gray horn is it contains both the somatic sensory nuclei and the visceral sensory nuclei, which are going to receive sensory input from either side of the spinal cord. So the function of the dorsal root ganglion is it contains the somatic sensory and the visceral sensory nuclei. Got it? Now, we're going to have some motor commands that have to come down from our brain When we take these sensations up to the brain and the brain interprets them, we have to have motor commands come down and out of the spinal cord. And it turns out we have two motor nuclei. We have a somatic motor nucleus and a visceral motor nucleus. The visceral motor nucleus is going to have the effects on the viscera of the body. Like if it's really hot and your sweat glands are going to squeeze out sweat, that's visceral motor. If we have any of our digestive system that needs to kick off, that's going to be visceral motor. If I'm moving my body, my skeletal muscle, that's somatic motor. Somatic motor is always movement of skeletal muscle. Visceral motor is always movement of some kind of viscera, soft organ. Well, it turns out that the visceral motor nucleus lives in the lateral gray horn of each half of the spinal cord. I would receive information from the brain, synapsing here. The motor neuron from the visceral motor nucleus would send its axons out this direction. The ventral root is always going to have the axons of motor neurons exiting the spinal cord. We don't have a ventral root ganglion because the neurons live in the nucleus of the spinal cord and will extend all the way out to the visceral muscle. Okay, or at least to a ganglion and then to the visceral muscle. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So the visceral motor nucleus is in the lateral gray horn, and that's the function of the lateral gray horn. It contains the visceral motor nuclei of the neurons that will exit the spinal cord. The anterior gray horn contains the somatic motor nuclei. When I say somatic motor, I mean the movement of skeletal muscle. And these neurons would receive information from your brain, send their axons out the ventral root, since the ventral root contains all motor axons exiting the spinal cord. So when we look at the gray matter of the spinal cord, we can see that the posterior gray horn has the somatic sensory and the visceral sensory nuclei. And notice the somatic are kind of closer to the outside, the visceral a little bit closer to the middle. So, posterior gray horn, somatic and visceral motor nuclei. They're going to receive input from sensory neurons coming into the spinal cord and send information up to the brain. The lateral gray horn contains the visceral motor nucleus that's going to control movement of smooth muscle and sometimes other viscera in the, it lives in the lateral gray horn. The anterior gray horn contains the somatic motor nucleus that's going to control skeletal muscle, and every level of the spinal cord, all the way down, all 31 segments, control different muscles or sensing different parts of your skin. So, now, we have these areas where axons can cross in the white matter and in the gray matter. Because the right half of my brain is monitoring and controlling the left half of my body, and vice versa, some neurons, at some point, the neurons are going to have to cross to the opposite side. Some of them come in and cross pretty quickly. Some of them come in and go up a ways and then cross. Some are coming down from the brain and cross at a specific location. If the neurons are unmyelinated, meaning they have no myelin, they're going to be in the gray matter. So the gray commissures contain the unmyelinated axons that cross the spinal cord. Gray matter contains the unmyelinated axons. The gray commissures do. The gray commissures have unmyelinated axons that cross over the spinal cord. The white commissures contain the myelinated axons that need to cross over to the opposite side of the spinal cord. Okay? So anytime you see a white commissure, it's got white matter or myelinated axons. Anytime you see the gray commissures, it has gray matter or unmyelinated axons crossing the spinal cord. So now we're going to go look at the white columns. These three areas of white matter are called white columns. The reason they are called that is because if we were looking at the spinal cord in 3 dimensions, so let's say I have a piece of the spinal cord like this, okay? And here's the gray matter. We're not focusing on that. So, and this is 3-dimensional. If I have some neurons that are going to exit a particular sensory nucleus down here, and they're all going to be monitoring the same information from the same part of our body, all of those neurons are going to travel together. They get bundled into a tract. Remember, a bundle of axons outside the CNS is called a nerve, but inside the CNS it can be called a fascicle or tract. Well, all of these axons are going to send their sensory information up to the brain, and they're all going to be bundled together in the same cable. Let's say I have some other information coming in at another level of the spinal cord. It's going to synapse, and I'm going to have a bunch of neurons here that are all going to send their axons up to the brain through a different tract. And if I look at it, one of these might be in the lateral white column, the other one might be in the posterior white column at those levels of the spinal cord. So when I look at this looks like a column, like the big columns that hold up buildings and things, okay? So they call the white matter of the spinal cord the white columns, okay? And what we contain in those white columns are tracts of axons ascending or descending the spinal cord, okay? So when it comes to the white columns, all that we say about the white columns is the white columns contain tracts of axons ascending and descending the spinal cord. We're going to talk about the tracts in the next video or in another video in just a little bit, and there's specific tracts flowing in specific white columns at different levels of the spinal cord. And if you ever get into some deep neurobiology, then you'll really understand why when someone injures a certain part of their spine, the doctor knows which muscles or which viscera or which sensations should be disrupted. They can order an MRI of a certain part of the spine and see if there's compression of a nerve that's interrupting flow into or out of that level of the spinal cord. Okay, so now the dorsal root, we already said, contains the axons of neurons, of sensory neurons coming into the spinal cord. The dorsal root ganglion contains the somata of those incoming sensory neurons. And the ventral root is going to contain the axons of motor neurons exiting the spinal cord. So you should know those three definitions. Finally, the last definition on the table is the spinal nerve. Now, if you're following along, we're doing the table now that's at the top of page 82. Okay, the spinal nerve, you should know there's 31 pairs, and that all spinal nerves are mixed. They have both sensory and motor information coming in. All right, so hopefully that covers all of these structures at different levels of the spinal cord. The last part I want to do is some sensory pathways. Okay, I'm going to do the sensory pathways and the motor pathways. Actually, I'm going to do those in a different video because this will take a little while, and we're already pushing 30 minutes. So I hope you know the anatomy of the spinal cord pretty well from this, and you know what's going on in which structures. You need to know where the sensory nuclei, where the sensory visceral motor and somatic motor nuclei are. You need to know what's happening in the spinal nerves and the two roots. Now this leads to something important. Like I said before, I'm going to erase half of the spinal cord because that half I don't need. But I want to show you something, why understanding this anatomy is important. Okay, and then we'll wrap up this video and I'll move on to the next topic in the note set. So if I were to look at the vertebrae are stacked like this, with their intervertebral disc. At every level of the vertebrae, if I were to look at the vertebrae from a lateral view, let's say I have a thoracic vertebra like this. They have a spinous process that points down. That's something unique about thoracic vertebrae. If I stack two vertebrae together, we have these articular facets that stick up, the superior and the inferior articular facet, and then I would have the intervertebral disc here. That creates this intervertebral foramen. And it turns out that your spinal cord is running right about here through the vertebral foramen. And that's where a spinal nerve is going to exit through the intervertebral foramina at every level of the spinal cord. Your vertebrae are numbered. They're named, and the name is based on the location of the spine and the number. C1, C2, C3, C4, until we get to C7. And then we get to thoracic nerve 1. That looks like a G, but it's supposed to be C7. Okay? And then thoracic vertebra 2, thoracic vertebra 3, and so on and so forth. Okay? Something that's important, I think, anatomically for people to know is this. In the cervical region, the nerve comes before the before the vertebra. For example, if my spinal cord is running here, I'm going to have a nerve coming out like this on either side. That's cervical nerve number 1. And then I have cervical vertebra number 1. Then I have cervical nerve 2 and cervical vertebra 2. C3, C4 comes before cervical vertebra 4, C5, C6, and I didn't draw this very well, and then C7 comes off here. So let me just put these vertebrae in, C5, C6, and C7. Okay, those got crushed. Sorry. So you can see how in the cervical region it's the nerve first and then the vertebra. So if someone has a pinched C2 or C3, a doctor knows to look between cervical vertebra C1 and C2 and C2 and C3 on an MRI or CT scan and see if there's any disc damage or loss of the gap between the vertebrae, and see if there's a crushed nerve. Let's say if you had a problem with the right side of your body in the cervical region or in your upper arm, some numbness and tingling or loss of motor function. Okay. Now, one caveat is after C7, we have cervical nerve 8. There's only 7 cervical vertebrae, but there are 8 cervical nerves. The numbering didn't work out as they went through, so they just did this. Then, after thoracic vertebra 1 is where nerve T1 comes off, like this. So in the cervical region, the nerve comes before the vertebra. So if someone says, you know, you have impingement at cervical nerve 5, then you know it's somewhere between C4 and C5 vertebrae. You should be looking on the MRI for a lack of spacing or some kind of compression or a bulged or herniated disc. Okay. C8 comes after C7, but before T1. It's an extra nerve. And then after the thoracic vertebra, all the way down, the nerve comes after the vertebra and the thoracic and the lumbar and the sacral region. Okay. Just something interesting to note. So that's the way the nerves are named. Now, the reason I point that out is this. Let's say if someone is having some numbness and tingling in a certain part of their arm here. Your skin, if you look, there's a picture in your lab manual or in your lecture text as well. Let's say someone's arm is sitting out like this. And you have your digits. Oops, somebody had too many kids and with their cousin or something, had extra fingers. So there's actually areas of your skin that are mapped out like this. There's slices of skin that each nerve monitors. So C8 to T1 is really monitoring sort of this side of your arm. So if you had a crushed nerve in your neck, you might be experiencing some numbness and tingling in a certain part of your skin. The doctor knows which nerves are going to go there. If it was on this side, then it'd be a different cervical nerve, and they would go looking at where the damage is. And because the nerves are both sensory and motor, if the damage is up here, it could be affecting sensory and motor. If it's only sensory interruption, so let's say you have interruption of here's something that docs do. You go in and they'll rub your fingers. Does this feel normal? Does this feel normal? Does this feel normal? Does that feel normal? And if you feel numbness and tingling in a certain part, they know the damage is to the nerve down here, or it could be up at the spinal cord. And sometimes it's in both places. So they can run a nerve conduction velocity or an EMG, electromyogram, of your nerve to see if it's conducting properly. If there's no problems down here, then you look up at the cervical region, maybe the damage is up here. And they know exactly which nerves should be affected because every swath of skin is innervated by a different nerve. If you have sensory interruption only, so not only do they rub all your fingers, they'll ask you things like this. Pull up on my hand, push down on my hand. Pull out on my hand, push in on my hand. And they have you do it on both sides. If one side's weak, but the other side feels normally strong, then maybe you have something damaging the motor output. If sensory and motor are both damaged, then you could be pressing the nerve here or pressing both roots. If sensory only is interrupted, then maybe you know the damage is at the dorsal root. The bulge is in one particular direction. If only motor is interrupted at that level of the spinal cord, then maybe the bulge is pressing on the ventral root because you're only interrupting motor output. So, knowing the anatomy of the spinal cord and these roots in the spinal nerve, and knowing this anatomy, very often, will tell a physician where in the spinal column do we need to be focusing an MRI or a CT scan. They don't want to waste all that money on all the films doing the whole spinal column if we know the issue is only in the upper extremities or maybe the lower extremities. If you're having sciatica down the back of your leg, they'll look at the nerves and the joint spacing and all of this. If you have foot drop, you can't hold your foot up, and they ask you to sit down and point your toes at the ceiling and hold it. If one foot continually drops, you have motor damage to a nerve going to your foot. If you can't feel your foot, there's some numbness and tingling. It might be sensory damage at a certain level of the spinal cord that controls those muscles. So that's really important for physicians and healthcare professionals to know, so that you know why you're taking your x-rays or your MRIs or your CT scans and what you're looking for. Anyway, that's why the knowledge of the spinal cord and the dorsal root being purely sensory, the ventral root being purely motor output, and the spinal nerve being mixed, and all of these parts, sensory and motor, are pretty important. A little bit later, we're going to talk about the actual white columns, whether they're ascending in sensory or descending in motor. So if there's damage to the spinal cord, you could know if it's in which particular column, depending on if it's sensory or motor and which part of the body is being affected. We're not going to get into super detail. Anyway, I hope you learned something. I hope you had some fun while you did it. Hope you had as much fun as I did. And I hope to see you on the flip side in the next video. Thanks for watching.